Okay, Recitation 3, Probability and Genetics. For question 1, under what conditions would you use multiplicative rule or the product rule, and what notation would you use? So the multiplicative rule is when you have phrases like and. So what is the probability of rolling a 2 and a 6? How likely will I roll a 6 and a 4? And so in that case, we are multiplying because these probabilities are mutually exclusive, which means that no matter how many times I roll this dice or no matter how many times I flip a coin, I will be having an equal probability of rolling that same number on that next roll. So no matter how many times I roll a number 2, that next roll, I still will have a 1 in 6 chance of rolling a number 2. Under what conditions should you use the addition or sum rule, and what notations would you use? For the additive rule, this is or. So how likely will I roll either a 6 or a 2? So with each roll, I have a 1 in 6 chance of getting on a six-sided fair die. I have a 1 in 6 chance of rolling any number. So in this case, I have a 1 in 6 chance of rolling a 6, and I have a 1 in 6 chance of rolling a 2. So the likelihood of me rolling either a 6 or a 2 would be 1 6 plus 1 6, 2 6, or reduced to 1/3. Question number 3. If you flip a coin 6 times and 4 of those are heads, using the binomial probability distribution formula, determine the probability of getting heads 4 of the 6 times. Reminder, you can use a calculator during your recitation quizzes. So, for binomial distribution, this is your binomial distribution formula. P of x, or your probability of successes, is equal to n factorial over n minus x factorial times x factorial, all multiplied by p to the x and q to the n minus x. So really what this is saying is your probability of getting whatever it is you're asking for, these successes, is equal to the number of trials that you run, factorial, divided by the number of trials minus the number of successes. So this is your number of failures, factorial, times your number of successes, factorial. And all of that is multiplied by your chances of success, P, to your number of successes, times your chances of failure, to the number of failures per entire trial. So when we look at this, this is just a question that I made up. Doesn't have anything to do with this question. But so for binomial distributions, so an MCAT passage has 6 multiple choice questions with 4 answers per choice per question. So if I forgot to study, what are the chances that I'll get at least 4 out of the 6 correct per section? So with this, I'm identifying my um, chances of success is going to be 1/4 because there's 4 questions, there's 4 answers total. I'm looking for my successes to be 4, and my total number of trials are 6. So with the factorial, the most important thing of what I want to point out here is that when we are expanding our factorials out, we are doing, so if I'm doing 6 factorial, right? 6 exclamation point. That's 6 factorial. It's 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, right? And as I'm identifying these numbers, this would be 2 factorial, and this is 4 factorial. So that's why you see 2 times 1, 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. So what you can do is, as you see, 4 times 3 times 2 times 1 is both on the top and the bottom. So we can go ahead and cross that out entirely. And so what we're left with is this 6 times 5 over 2 times 1. So it becomes a lot easier, right? So then we have this 30 over 2. And then with these ones, we're just going to get our calculators out for it. So we have 1/4 to the fourth and 3/4 to the second. So 1/4 is I have a 1 in 4 chance of getting the question right, and 3/4 is I have a 3 in 4 chance of getting the question wrong. And I want to know how the likelihood of me getting it right 4 times. So that's why this question right, 1 in 4, is to the fourth, and question wrong, 3 in 4, is to the second, because I'm doing six total. So 4 + 2 is equal to 6, right? And so the math all comes out. And so anyway, just to wrap this up, it's a really low chance of not failing the MCAT if you don't study. So back to our original question. So using the binomial distribution, what's the probability of landing on heads on a fair-sided coin 4 out of 6 times when flipping a fair coin? So the coin has two equally probable outcomes. Therefore, the ratio of success or failure is equal to 1 in 2 or 1/2. So our n, which is our number of trials, is going to be 6, which we see here. Our X is our number of successes. We want to know how many times, what's the probability of landing on heads 4 of those times, right? So that's going to be our successes. And then both our P and our Q, as I said, are going to be 1/2 here, because we are flipping a coin which only has two sides. So in using, once you've identified these numbers, it's literally just plug and chug. Go back to your original equation here and type it all in, write it all out. And my suggestion is to write it out like this. Get rid of the numbers that are repetitive on both the numerator and denominator, and then plug and chug and get your answers that way. So for question 4, a coin is flipped 4 times. What is the probability that it will land on tails all 4 times? So with this one, what is the probability that you will land on tails and tails and tails and tails, right? That's what this question is asking. When it's saying land on tails all 4 times, it's asking tails and tails and tails and tails. So when we use the word and, we know we're looking at mutually exclusive events. We want to know, so we would use the multiplicative rule. So yeah, and does landing on one flip affect the landing of another flip? No, it doesn't. So that's how we know these are mutually exclusive, and we're using the word and for each of these times. So we're going to use the multiplicative rule. So, yeah. Question 5. Cross together two double heterozygous parents for plant height and flower color. So double heterozygous just means that they are heterozygous for both traits. So as we see, dominant recessive, tall, a capital S is dominant over short, a lowercase s, and blue, a capital W, is dominant over white, which is a lowercase w. So what's the probability that a randomly selected offspring will be tall and have white flowers? So a tall genotype, S is dominant, capital is dominant over lowercase, and a white genotype, capital, is dominant over W. So as we recall, white is going to be our lowercase here. So we know that in order for us to get a white genotype, we need to have two of these lowercase w's. And for this one, because tall is a dominant gene, we only need to have at least one allele. So what we do, it's most easy to split these characteristics up into their own Punnett squares. You're welcome to do a 16 square Punnett square, but it takes up a lot of time, and on the exam, you wouldn't really have that capability. So it's best to use, that's why we learn about these additive and multiplicative rules. So this one we're asking for, what's the probability of being tall and white flowers? So we know it's going to be the multiplicative rule. So we can just figure out the probability of tall and figure out the probability of white, and then multiply those two together. So I've started this here. So we have our parent 1 on the left vertical axis of our square, and we have parent 2 on the top horizontal axis of our square. So we have, because they're both heterozygous, it doesn't really matter, but so we'll have capitals and lowercase. So you fill it all out, and so then you would figure out the probability of having a tall genotype. So how many out of four are tall? And so if it was one fourth that are tall, then you would do one fourth times however many are short. So if it was one half, I'm sorry, white. So if it was one half that were white, then you would do one fourth times one half is equal to, and in that case, it would be one eighth, but that's not the correct answer. I'm making up numbers, but I'm just giving you an idea of how to solve something like this. So, question number 6, Mendel finds a new species of pea plants that produce two different colored flowers. One is white and one is black. He crosses the two parents together. One is a homozygous recessive, so this is a key here, and the other is a heterozygous parent. So what's the probability that the plant in the F1 generation has white flowers? White is dominant over black. We have a homozygous recessive, so that means they have to be homozygous if it's a recessive expressing plant. But so we have a recessive plant. So this is really just a double. You don't necessarily need it. You could just say recessive and you know that it had to be homozygous. But so we have a recessive plant. So we know that one of them is going to be lowercase, lowercase, and a heterozygous plant. So we know the other one's going to be uppercase, lowercase. So that's what I have here, lowercase, lowercase, uppercase, lowercase, because it's heterozygous. So then you would just fill out your Punnett squares and you would determine what the probability of having a flower, having an F1 plant that has white flowers. So remember, with a dominant trait, you only need to have one allele. So how many out of the four have at least one white allele? So the questions below all refer to the following pedigree. The locus for allele DD, capital D, lowercase d, determines how cilia function within the body. Mutations at this allele cause abnormal ciliary function, resulting in a clinical disorder characterized by frequent respiratory infections, also known, so including ears, sinus, and lungs, as well as infertility. In the pedigree, black circles or squares represent individuals affected by the disorder. White circles or squares represent unaffected individuals. Remember that if a trait is rare in a population, such as this one, we assume individuals marrying into the family are not carriers unless information provided indicates otherwise. Don't copy your answers from previous sections. So in this, we're looking at individuals that are affected are these black individuals. So if you are unfamiliar, circles are females, squares are males. These numbers, these Roman numerals represent your generation. So this is generation one, this is generation two, this is generation three, and so forth. And then typically you wouldn't necessarily have the letters here, you would just have these numbers, but these Armanic numbers represent the individuals within a generation. So it's one, two, three, four, five. So because they're all in this generation, you just continue to count across, regardless of it skipping to a new section. So see, this doesn't start again at one here, it's four and five. So anyway, just to make all that clear, so in our first question, we want to know, identify the genotype for each of the following individuals. And yes, I would agree that it probably would be useful to print out the pedigree, but I'm not going to solve all of them with you. I'm just going to solve a few of them. And so looking at this, and we will kind of move a little bit forward too with kind of looking at how to determine the pedigree. So it's important to look at this to consider the pedigree and what type that would be. So because we have some individuals here that are affected, they have to have at least both affected alleles if it's a recessive, or they have to have at least one if it's a dominant. So when we're considering this, we're gonna come back to this question because the next question will help you to solve this. So we're looking at what the mode of inheritance is for this disorder. And so we have a bunch of different modes here, right? And so I'm just going to go through the common modes of transmission, and we'll be able to determine better people's genotypes. So for an autosomal, so the difference between autosomal and sex-linked is that autosomal is it's not related to the sex gene at all. So we have 23 different chromosomes, one of which is our sex chromosome, the X and Y. So autosomal just means that it's affected on any like somatic cell, and it doesn't necessarily not somatic cell, I'm sorry, any chromosome, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with your reproductive chromosome. So it can affect males and females equally. And so that's what we're seeing here. We're kind of seeing this equal distribution between males and females that are being affected. And we're also seeing that with this dominant trait that there are no generations that are skipped. So every generation that there's somebody affected, we're seeing that there are other affected individuals. And so a dominant trait is you're not capable of being a carrier. You will always show that trait. You always and then, so for autosomal recessive, what we're seeing is, and you're not necessarily, so these are here, these half colored are here just to notate it, but you won't necessarily, like on our pedigree that we have for these questions, we don't actually have these half colored notations, but what they do mean is that it's a carrier. So it's not necessarily somebody that's affected by it, but they do carry the gene, but you won't always have that information. So in this instance, what you're seeing is like two carrier parents, an affected individual, but technically this disorder has skipped this generation because none of these children are actually affected by the whatever this disease or character trait is. And so, but then we're seeing this person here is affected by it. So this is a giveaway for recessive traits is that you will see skips in generations. So this generation technically not affected. This one is. This generation technically not affected. This one is. And then sex-linked traits, they're traits that are linked to the sex chromosome that either X or Y. And so when we're looking at X-linked recessive traits, males are affected more frequently than females. This is because males only carry one X chromosome on their sex chromosomes, whereas females carry two. So it is much more likely that a male will be affected by an X-linked recessive disease because they only have one X. So a female, she could have a non-affected and an affected X, and she would not express that trait. An X-linked dominant is it affects 100% of the males. Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me. One affected males will have 100% affected daughters and 0% affected sons. This is because males will always only ever give the X chromosome to the daughter. So if the male is affected, all of his daughters will get that affected X chromosome, but none of his sons will because he has to give the Y chromosome to his sons. So now this is when we're talking about just an affected male and not an affected female. Obviously, that changes a little bit if the female is affected too. But in this case, so if it's an X-linked dominant, any affected male will have 100% affected females and 0% affected sons. In an X-linked Y chromosome, right? Enough said. Females will never be affected because they don't have that chromosome. Males will obviously always be affected because they have that chromosome. So, with that in mind, let's head back to our initial question to be able to solve some of these pedigrees. So, because we're seeing that this generation is not affected, and again, remember that we're not going to necessarily see if these people are affected or not. We don't know who the carriers are, but we are assuming that anybody that marries into the family, so that would be B1, B6, C4, C3, that these individuals are not carriers unless the information provided indicates otherwise. So by looking at this, we're seeing that this generation is not affected. And we're also seeing that this generation right here is not affected. So this generation is affected, is not affected, yet they are having individuals that are affected. So that leads us to believe that this has to be um, a recessive disease. Now, we're not sure yet if it's autosomal or sex-linked, but based on our previous slides, I think you could suss out whether or not this is X-linked or autosomal, because remember, there's very particular patterns to autosomal versus sex-linked. So we know that this is a recessive trait. So we can go ahead and assume that A1 and A2 are heterozygous because they have a dominant allele that is not affected, but they have to each both have a dominant allele a recessive allele that is affected because they have um, affected children. Okay, so we can assume that A1 and A2 are heterozygous. And as we go through, so then we would know that B2, B4, C5, and D2 are all going to be homozygous recessive for this trait. Um, we can assume at the very least that somebody like B1 would be D question mark because we're not sure. Same thing with B6, and C4 and C3. Those are all going to be at the very least capital D with a question mark because they are not affected, but we're still trying to suss out whether or not they're at least a carrier. And so based on our findings in this pedigree, we can assume that at least two of these individuals that are marrying into the family are carriers because the subsequent generation is affected. So, for example, if we look at B5 and B6, we know that they both are coming together and having a child that is affected. So they both have to be carriers. That's the only way that a child will be affected. So we can assume that in the same way that we can assume that A1 and A2 are carriers, we can also assume that B5 and B6 are both carriers. So using that type of logic, you can go through and determine whether or not each individual is a carrier, whether or not they're affected, and go from there. So with this, whether or not the mode of inheritance, we know that it has to be recessive. Going through and understanding the differences between autosomal, where we're having a pretty equal distribution of male and female, versus and same here, right? Like it's still it's the same thing. You're having an equal distribution. It's just it can skip a generation versus if you have a X-linked recessive, you're going to have a higher likelihood of males being affected than females because they only have one X. So look back at your pedigree and determine if there's any patterns of inheritance in that way. So for question 9, focus on individual B3 in the pedigree, which is right here. Draw out a Punnett square to determine the probability that B3 is a carrier. So what is the probability that B3 is a carrier? We already know that the parents A1 and A2 have to be heterozygous for this disease. We can go ahead and draw out that Punnett square. So here's our heterozygous grandmother and grandfather, great grandmother, great grandmother, whatever you want to call them, generation ones. And then you would just fill this out and determine what is the probability of them being a carrier. Um, and with this, I would also like to mention um, that being a carrier does not mean that you are affected. Like an affected individual is affected. So remember that when you are determining this, Somebody who is affected is in and of itself. So they would not be included in the math. So for question number 10, C2 and C3 are considering having, C2 and C3, that's these individuals here, are considering having additional children. However, having had a child with this disorder, they visit a genetic counselor to determine the probability that their future child will have the disorder. If C2 and C3 have another child, what is the probability that the child will have this disorder? So, and we'll type the number in a percentage, and include the percentage sign. So, in order to determine this, we again, because D2 is affected, we know that C2 and C3 are heterozygous. So they are not affected themselves, so they are not homozygous, but they are heterozygous because they both have come together to have a child that's affected. So we would figure out this Punnett square, and we would figure out what is the likelihood. So in this case, there's four of them. So how many out of four individual or out of four would a child likely have the disorder? So if it was, you know, two out of four, then that's 50%. And so then you would write your answer in percentage, right? So remember that one out of three is 33%, one out of four is 25%, one out of two is 50%, and so forth and so on. One out of one, if it's a 100%, that's 100% chance. If everybody is going to be affected, that's 100% chance. So question 11, looking at D5, which I have right here. So this is D5, this individual. So looking at D5, what's the probability that D5 is a carrier for the disorder? And then it says, remember, if a trait is rare in a population such as this one, we assume that anybody marrying into the family are not carriers unless the information provided indicates otherwise. So D5, what is the likelihood that D5 is a carrier? So we know that C5, which I have indicated across here, is affected. So they have two lowercase d's. As far as C4, at the very least, they for sure have a capital D. Whether or not, um, you know, based on this information, we are assuming that the individual marrying into the family is not a carrier. The information here does not indicate that C4 is a carrier based on the previous two. It's not a 100% for a fact that C4 is not a carrier. And I know for some people it's going to be really hard to like wrap your head around because that was for me. But let's just, for simplicity's sake, assume that C4 is not a carrier based on the information that we have so far. So we would have capital D and lowercase d for our C4 and C5. So then if we were to do the Punnett square out, we would be able to find the percentage of individuals that are carriers. If these two individuals were to have I'm sorry, the probability that D5 is a carrier for the disorder. So this filling out this Punnett square will determine whether D5, what the percentage is of D5 being a carrier. So now in another population of humans, 5% of the population is a carrier for Celia disorder. Taylor is from this population. What is the probability that Taylor is a carrier of the disorder if Taylor has the same risk of being a carrier as everyone else in this population? Hint, don't overthink this one. It's as easy as it seems. There is a 5% chance of being a carrier in the population. Taylor has the same risk of being a carrier as everyone else. Yes, it is that easy. Final question. D5 from our original pedigree goes on an exotic vacation and meets the love of their life, Taylor, from the previous question. What is the probability that D5 and Taylor will have a child with the disorder? And we again are writing our answers in as a numerical, as a percentage. So Taylor, we have figured out what their probability of being a carrier is, right? It is this easy. For D5, we figured it out in question 11. So we are taking the probability from 11 and the probability from 12 to answer question 13. So our first step is to figure out the probability that both are carriers. We have those numbers. Then once we set that number aside, number two, if they both are carriers, so just assuming that they're both carriers, what is the probability that their child will be affected? So if both people are carriers, they have a 1/2 chance of passing on a affected allele. So we can figure out what the probability of having an affected child is by multiplying a carrier times a carrier. So 1/2 times 1/2. And then we multiply both probabilities, as in the probability from 1 times the probability from 2. And that is equal to our probability of the child with a disorder. And then in order to get it into a percentage, we convert it by multiplying it by 100. So, for example, if Taylor and D5 both have a 50% chance of being a carrier, so that's 0.50, then number one is equal to number one, the probability that both are carriers is going to be zero point 0.5 times zero point 0.5. So that equals 0.25. Okay. And now, if they both are carriers, the probability that a child is affected will be 0.25 because you have a 1/2 chance times a 1/2 chance. So that comes out to 1/4 chance. So for number three, then we are going to multiply both of these probabilities. So we have 0.25 times 0.25, and that will give us our decimal answer of the likelihood of having a child with a disorder. So in order to convert it into a percentage, all we have to do is multiply this number by 100 and stick a percent sign on the end. Warning, this is not the answer. This is not the answer. I'm just giving you an example. Good luck.